Thank you for joining me today on Surviving the System. This is Dancing Dave, and today we are going to be talking about a topic that I'm willing to bet is near and dear to a lot of you out there, as school has completely changed and what the meaning of that word is at this point in time in our country, given the crisis situation that we are under. Myself here, my kids are all home. And for the last couple of weeks, it has been stressful, to say the least. And we have been doing our best to keep up with keeping our children educated while we're waiting for our public school system to catch up to that fact. So that's going to be our topic today, because I'm willing to bet that I'm not the only one that is going through this type of a situation. And I'd like to talk a little bit more in depth about the public education system and some of the reason that we're in this situation today. So our guest will help me address that today. But as always, before we get going, I do want to take a moment and start the day with gratitude. As you've heard me say before, and if you haven't heard me before, and this is your first introduction, the reason for doing this is if I was sitting down as a coaching client and you were asking me some tips to be productive, or how to get in the right frame of mind, or just how to get your day started on the right way, one of the best ways to make sure that you're going to have a fulfilling, productive day is to start your day with gratitude. Start off your day by just naming even 3 things that you're grateful for right when you wake up. So I'm going to take a moment and talk about one of the things that I'm grateful for. And right now I am grateful for my children. Even with the current situation causing the stress that it has caused for my wife and I are both working at home. All of our children are at home with us, trying to handle business, everything. The children have been amazing. It's difficult because they want our attention and they want our time, but they have also been mentally my saving grace through this entire unprecedented situation. Right when I feel like I'm about at the moment to just lose my mind, I'll look over and my daughter is just doing something that is so absurd that it just makes me bust out laughing. And those are the moments that help us get through this crisis. And so if my children are ever at the point that they're listening to this, some of them are very young and may not listen to this for a long time, I hope that they do realize, and I hope that I have done a good job of making sure that they know this one way or the other. But I do appreciate them, and I am so grateful that they have brought that kind of laughter and sanity into my life. Now, with that said, along with my children as well, our guest today is going to be helping us do a little bit of a deep dive into the education system here in, well, not just America, but in North America. So Cameron Cope is the founder, owner of a company called TechnoTutor. Now, TechnoTutor, I was introduced to, I don't even remember how many years ago. It's been probably about 6 or 7 years ago, and we met a gentleman who explained the process of TechnoTutor, gave us a demo on it, and at the time, it just wasn't the right time for us, but we definitely saw the value in it. So fast forward until about a year ago, and it came back to my mind. Just for some reason, I really don't know why. I just remembered the program, and I said, with my daughter getting ready to start kindergarten, and with my 2 older children, one transitioning into high school, one about to go into middle school, this would really be something that I think could help them as well. Maybe we should take a look at this program again. Maybe we should look at TechnoTutor. So my wife and I tracked it down. I went online, Googled it, of course, found the website, just put a submission in there and kind of did a little bit of a recap of what I just said there. Hey, I'd learned about this previously. I don't even know if you still have anybody out in this area for me to talk to. And not too long after that, Cameron got in touch with me on Facebook And we had a few conversations, talked a little bit about the advances that they've made in TechnoTutor, where it's at now as opposed to where it was the few years ago that we looked. And a TechnoTutor representative came into our home. We went over it, did a live demonstration with our children there. Even just in that short time, my son loved it. He was just captivated by it with how quickly he was able to pick up on, I think, the demonstration he did with medical terminology, and how quickly he caught on to medical terminology being a sixth grader. And fast forward, we have been using the program now for almost a year, coming up on a year here. With full transparency, we have not been using it to its fullest potential. And I say that to bring the point around that even without us having really done a deep dive and explored all of the uses of TechnoTutor, my daughter that's in kindergarten we recently did parent-teacher conferences before the quote-unquote apocalypse now, and the information that we got back, the feedback was that her reading and her vocabulary was at a very advanced level for someone of her age. And the only thing that we had done differently was the introduction of TechnoTutor. So once the transition happened here within the United States and around the world, and our children came back home, I noticed some of the struggles that I was going through, and I reached out to Cameron and said, I think that this would be a really good opportunity for you to let other people know about TechnoTutor and just to talk about why is this such a struggle? Why is the public school system so inadequately equipped to deal with something like this? I transitioned working from home in no time at all. I was all set and ready to go. Why was it not the same for the school system? So we'll get into all of that. We'll get into a lot more about the education system, and I would like to welcome Cameron. Cameron, thank you very much for joining me today on Surviving the System.
Hey, Dave. I'm glad to be here. And I have to say, I really like hearing those stories like what you talked about with your daughter, because that's the whole reason we're doing all of this.
Yeah.
And so I'm really grateful just to at least hear that, right? But kind of to continue on your theme of gratitude, I saw this really interesting thing on Facebook. Someone wrote, you're not stuck at home. You're safe at home. It's kind of like switching your attitude about this whole situation. So I was like, yeah, that's a really cool point. We're not stuck here. We're here. We're actually safe. So it's not a bad thing. But yeah, I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, that is a very good point. And it is something interesting too. And I know that I'm in a unique position, not necessarily so unique, but in a fortunate position where the job that I do, I was able to transition to work from home pretty quickly. We're still dealing with the economic struggles. A lot of our clients have kind of backed off because they're facing some of these struggles. We had a couple clients who were in the bar and restaurant industry, and for all intents and purposes, they're done right now,
right,
as it's all completely closed. But being able to transition over was pretty quick. The only thing that made it challenging was having to take care of the children at the same time as trying to work from home. So I can't complain too much about it because they're here, they're healthy, we're all together. This is before the advent of the 20th century, really. That was how most of life was. And even in other parts of the world today, you have multi-generational families that still live all under one roof. Yeah. So, well, I would really just like to turn it over to you, and why don't we just dive right in? Let's get an introduction of TechnoTutor. If you wouldn't mind, give us an overview of what is TechnoTutor, why is it so effective in helping with reading and vocabulary, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, it's interesting having this conversation now because, with this whole thing going on with this virus and everything, what we're getting right now, from my perspective, is a big preview in a certain sense of what life will be like when we have full automation, and yet people don't have the ability to, like what you're talking about, transition to working from home, or, for example, when there's no jobs available, right? And so the point of TechnoTutor is to prepare the population, everybody across the globe. I mean, we're global. We're not just thinking only the U.S. We're looking at everybody, because this problem affects everyone, of automation and AI and all these things that are coming. People have to be prepared for a world where a task is not just given to you. You do that task and then you're paid for it. You have to apply some creativity in, you could call that entrepreneurship if you like. You could call it, self-employment, working from home, whatever you want to call it. The big corporations are more and more and more moving towards, replacing people with machines and AI and so forth. And now with this whole virus thing going on, I think we're one of two things. We're either seeing an acceleration towards that, or at the very least, people now starting to see what life will be like in that. So it's almost like preparing us to deal with that eventuality, right? And so, with TechnoTutor, we started TechnoTutor in 2013, the beginning of 2013, and right away, this is what we were talking about, automation, AI replacing jobs, and the fact that our education system has not evolved, so to speak, to be able to prepare everybody for that inevitable reality. And so now it's kind of like a big kind of slap in the face of everyone seeing like, oh, what would life be like if there were no jobs available? And we're not saying all jobs will be gone. There are certain things that, you can do from home and so forth, and there's certain jobs that require human, interaction and so forth. But now you have, even before this happened, we were getting most of our groceries through delivery services. We weren't eating out as much as we used to, just to name a few things, and retail had already started to, decline and so forth. I don't know all the exact statistics, but, something like 60% of shopping malls were supposed to already be closing down within the next 5 or 10 years or something, if not sooner. And so we already are moving towards that point. But I think a lot of people, even though they see it, there's still sort of a little bit of denial about it, like, well, I'm going to be okay. But then we see something like this where it's not about the availability of your job. It's literally the government or just common sense or whatever saying, don't leave your home, stay at home. And now things that were dependent upon people going places and going out, suddenly that doesn't exist anymore. And so it's, it's kind of a weird time to be having a conversation, but from a certain perspective, it's the best time to be having this conversation, because there's so many parents out there, whether they're aware of automation and AI in these points, a lot of people I know are not necessarily, now they are, but they weren't necessarily before this, thinking about, is my child really getting the best education? I think there's a lot with regards to education in the context of school that we've taken for granted as parents, and I have 2 children. I have a 1.5-year-old daughter and a 3.5-year-old son. He's almost 3.5. And so, I'm a parent, so I understand what parents go through in their thought processes with regards to, their kids and education. But I also have a background, over 15 years of experience as a private tutor and academic mentor for, individual students and families and so forth. I even was a consultant for self-management centers where, they would treat like ADHD and, dyslexia and other things like that. And I was their on staff, tutor for like their clients and so forth. And so I've had a lot of experience in the education system. I've had lots of job offers, to be a teacher in the high schools and the private schools and all that kind of stuff. And so my experience is always the other side. You have the teacher and they see the student in the classroom, and then I would see the student on the other side whenever whatever's happening in the classroom isn't quite working for that student or whatever. Or the parents, want to get a little bit of an extra advantage or something. So I was that one-on-one support for the child. So I really saw through that experience the failures of the education system, because, when I started out, I was just working with, average, lower to middle class people, families. And by the end of my tutoring career per se, before we started with TechnoTutor, most of my clients were, upper income families. And I was charging, in some cases, several $100s an hour for my tutoring services. And I could see even at that level, those families, their kids were struggling with essentially the same things as the lower income families, which was that, the child themselves couldn't just open up the textbook and read it and understand it and teach it to themselves. That's something I had the ability to do, right? And it started to kind of, percolate a little bit in my mind as to like, what's going on here? Why is it that, I can read these books, I can understand it, I don't need someone to explain it to me. I never relied on the teachers themselves to give me the information. They were more just like directing the pace at, what we were covering and so forth, and more like a guidance. But, I would go to my lectures already knowing the information, or in many cases, I just would tune out because it wasn't interesting to me, and there's a lot of reasons for that too. So I wasn't necessarily the best student, but I had the ability to read and process information and understand. And so I could see that contrast with the average student, that they didn't have that ability. And so when you really break it down, why I got into TechnoTutors, I really started doing my homework as to how can I make a difference for students and families. And TechnoTutor itself is a technology, and in essence, this was the problem I wanted to solve. How can I make my students smarter? Right? Not just help them memorize the information for their schoolwork and pass the test, and then, because I'd have parents saying to me at the end of, the school year, teaching their student, let's say, algebra. Not even at the end of the school year, like before the school year was even over, they'd be saying, hey, do you have a spot for us next year for geometry? And back then I would think, well, how do you know they're going to need help with geometry? But of course they're going to need help, because they're not learning how to learn. They're just learning to memorize that information. And of course they're going to need help with the next year and the next year and the next year. And so from a certain perspective as a tutor, it's in a lot of ways kind of like being a psychologist. You're not really helping them. You're just helping them to cope with the situation, not really helping them to really take self-responsibility. But, I really wanted to figure out how can I really help. And, I had my own challenges in life growing up, and, my mom was 16 when I was born, so I didn't come from a very stable environment. So I had a lot of challenges in regards to emotional stability in other areas, even though academically those things, that wasn't so much of a challenge for me. But even when it comes to emotional stability and so forth, it all comes down to your ability to learn, to let go of the past, to learn new things, to question yourself, to question what you hear and all of that. And so, that all of those things combined kind of led me on a search. And when I found the TechnoTutor technology itself, it blew me away, because it does that thing that I realized as a tutor myself I couldn't do for my students, which is to support them to increase their ability to learn, their ability to read the books themselves, to understand it themselves, and to educate themselves, because really education at the root of it is a process of revealing your own potential, not so much just taking in what someone tells you and repeating it back. That's not real education. And I think we're all starting to see it. And I think parents right now are really starting to feel this pressure of like, okay, my children are at home now. How do I support them with their education? Because the teacher's not here. They might be doing some online things, but I'm going to have to at some level take some responsibility. And I think perhaps many parents are seeing the gaps, and they're seeing like, okay, this is what my kids are actually learning in school. This is what's going on. Okay, because they weren't really aware of it. They're going to work. They're doing what they're doing during the day. Their kids come home and they might have some homework, but they're not really getting that kind of like, daily view and like, and seeing really what's going on in there. And so, parents are hopefully, I think, beginning to see that there's some gaps in the education system. It's not preparing our children for a future where they're going to have to be very creative, and they're going to have to be able to read and process information and learn at a much higher level than they are right now. Obviously we have time. We can go into a lot of different areas, but at the end of the day, what TechnoTutor is all about is increasing your child's ability to learn. And that's something that the education system by design cannot do. It's not designed to do that. That was never the original intention of it. And it's been more of a Band-Aid to a certain degree. And, I think now the cracks in that are being exposed, and it's really time, my sort of call out there is for those who want to take more responsibility. We have the tools to do that. We have the understanding. We have the proof, all the evidence, everything that you would need to really see that what we're saying is the case, and all the research and all that stuff to back it up. But at the same time, I will say this. TechnoTutor is something you have to experience for yourself in person. There's nothing I can say about itself, the technology itself, that you wouldn't be able to see and understand better just by seeing it in person. And so, with our business itself, we have people who show families one-on-one. They explain how everything works. You get to try it out and all that, so you see for yourself. And we have lots of videos online, of our kids using it and other people and me describing my process with it, which you don't really see with any other education company that I'm aware of, where it's like you see the people who are behind the company actually doing it and talking about it and showing how their kids use it and all of that. So, but again, at the end of the day, this is about evolving the education system. So in a certain sense, we see ourselves as disruptors, but also an evolutionary process of, okay, the education system, it was relevant at a certain period of time in human history, but now there's new opportunities, new challenges, and we're going to have to evolve the system to be able to meet those. And I think it's time now that self-responsibility for the parent to be involved in that education process with their kids, that's going to be much needed. And I will add this one point too. When a parent gives the responsibility for education solely to somebody else or to something else, the problem is you lose an opportunity to build a bit of a bond and a relationship and trust with your child. Now, it doesn't mean that as a parent you can't do that in other ways as well. It's just another opportunity to build and strengthen that bond even more. And so just to give you an idea, with my kids here, life hasn't really changed for us. Like I'm not with my kids any more or less than I was before. And that's simply because, I already have the kind of life where I primarily work from home, and I'm with my kids a lot. And we always have one of either myself or my wife with our children 100% of the time. And now I know many parents have older kids, so they're thinking, well, this just applies when they're young. But with our children, we don't use babysitters. We don't send them to daycare or doing that stuff. And that's just the choice that we've made because we want to be there all the time to see what influences they have and, what they're being taught and what they're being told and so forth, so we can direct that process more. But it's also based on us understanding, things about the education system and all of that. So I'm sure we can go into a lot of that stuff. But this is really about taking your child and yourself as a parent, your ability to understand and apply information to a whole nother level that probably, until you really see what Technotutor can do, you did not think was possible, right? So sure we can go on from there, but that's the kind of nutshell of it.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So one thing that I think that you started to touch on, and I think that that's a great way for us to start. So let's talk about then the education system and what was the original intent of the education system? You say that it had a time and a place, and what was the time and what was the place and what was it for, and then why does it not work now?
It's a good question, and it's cool too because, people can go into all kinds of theories about things and say, what's the intention behind stuff and everything. But it's interesting because the people who are responsible for creating the education system that we have in the U.S. right now were very vocal and explicit about it, and they wrote it all down in books. And but I guess at that time, most people weren't going to necessarily read them, and especially today because the literacy levels are declining and so forth. But a really great resource for anybody who really wants to do, like you say, like a deep dive into all this is an author named John Taylor Gatto. He had just passed away last year, and he was he won New York State Teacher of the Year. He won New York City Teacher of the Year multiple times. He was a graduate from Columbia University. Very smart, very intelligent guy. He started off in the ad agencies in Manhattan, like an ad man, and then decided that world really wasn't where he wanted to put his passion. And so he put it into education and became a teacher. And he was the kind of teacher that would, I'll give you an example. He had these students, where they wouldn't really want to pay attention in class. So he would say, that's fine, just sit in the back and just don't disrupt the class for those who do want to learn. And he would observe them, though. There was one student, for example, who, he would see was always drawing comics in the back. So one day he asked him, you like drawing comics? The kid said, yeah, I do. He's like, well, I'm going to give you a pass for the rest of the semester to go to the library and, here's all these resources and study how to, actually make a real comic book and what the process is. And then at the end of that period, he got him an internship with a comic book publisher, and then the kid became a published comic book author. Just one example. So he didn't just focus on what he was supposed to teach them in the classroom. He really looked at what was each student interested in and supporting them within that. And, in terms of the roots of the education system, he's done a really great job of exposing, explaining, and all of that. And he's written a book called, I believe it's called The Underground History of American Education. I have it somewhere on my bookshelf behind me. But it's a great book that goes into all the roots of all of that. And he's written other books as well about his experiences in the classroom. And he basically explains that the roots of the education system, meaning you go to a classroom, there's a teacher, you have a set amount of subjects, and, after the bell rings, you go to the next class. That basic structure that we call schooling, that was a model that was based on the Prussian military model, the model that they used, and I think around the 1700s, to train their soldiers. And they became one of the most feared militaries, and they even exported mercenaries and all this stuff because they started applying this certain level of discipline to their soldiers and basically put them into a school sort of environment, but it was developed for the purpose of training their military. And so the industrialists and the people who are behind the foundation of our education system, our schooling system anyways, in America, took that basic approach and then created the education system modeled on that approach. And so many of the methods and techniques, but also just structures, were taken from that and applied into this schooling context. And, we have to understand that prior to compulsory schooling in America, most people were educated at home, and generally speaking, the parents would read the Bible and they would discuss things, and it was a very agrarian society, so children would learn based on common sense, and they would learn about the cycles of the seasons and planting, and and they would learn through kind of direct experience. But the books that they might have in the home would be, for example, like the Bible, which is a very high vocabulary book. And back then, you can look it up. Common Sense by Thomas Paine was a national bestseller. So there was almost universal literacy in the United States, during the 1800s and so forth. But through compulsory schooling, which really only became, a widespread compulsory system in the 1920s, around the time of the creation of the Federal Reserve and a bunch of other things, did you see like sort of the mass exodus out of the fields, let's say, and into the classrooms and so forth. And that's when the cities, started to become the focal centers of life in America, and those started to grow more. And in essence, the purpose behind it was to take people out of the fields and then put them into factories, for lack of a better term. Now, there's more to a factory than just literally the person sitting in the factory, turning the bolt on the tire of the car or something like that. There's also the person managing the factory. There's also secretaries. There's also people in offices. There's a whole infrastructure that goes behind what we call industrial society. And so the school system was designed to take people who basically, from the perspective of the industrial system, were totally uneducated within that context, even though they may have had a high level of reading ability and education, was to take them over time through a process where they were okay with sitting in a classroom for 8 hours a day, which means they were going to be okay sitting in a factory or an office, for example. And that process, like I said, has been, John Taylor Gatto, for example, talked about this at length and explained all the history behind it, and other authors as well. But even the people like, John Dewey, who are, is considered one of the founding fathers of the education system here in America, they explained that this was the purpose behind what they were doing. And I saw, a few years back, I saw an interesting interview with, it was one of these talks where, because Warren Buffett and Bill Gates are pretty close friends. And so sometimes they'll give talks together. And there was this one talk they were giving, and one of the people in the audience, I think it was at a university, one of the people in the audience asked Warren Buffett, he said, we have all of this AI, automation, all these things coming, and, what would you say we have to do about education? Because, obviously it's not preparing people for this inevitable loss of jobs, and even for the jobs that are available, it's going to be more competitive and so forth. Like, what are you rich people going to do about it? Basically, was kind of like the gist of the question. And Warren Buffett's answer was very telling, and he said, well, look, he said, back in the 1800s, we had the Industrial Revolution, and the education system was designed to handle that. It was a new opportunity, a new economy. People were moving into factories. We created an education system that dealt with that, and it's brought us to where we are now. And he said, now obviously our economies are moving into a new direction, and they'll figure it out. That was literally his answer. He said they'll figure it out, meaning we created the solution in education back then. We'll figure something out now. He didn't even say we. He said they will figure it out. And so when you look at the total context of what TechnoTutor and what we're doing with it, it is that solution, right? And I think many people might on the surface go, well, how are you going to change the school system into responding to this? And what we're saying is it's not going to happen through the school system. It's going to be people taking individual responsibility and doing it that way. I mean, if you look at it, it's like how would you change retail to respond to people wanting to be at home? It wouldn't be by changing the stores. It would be by delivering the food to the home, for example. And so when you look at what Amazon has done, it's totally revolutionized retail and brought everything into the home as opposed to you going out to get it. And so that's, in essence, what TechnoTutor is doing. It's bringing the technology home where the student, the parents, the whole family can educate themselves, and you're not reliant on the system to do that for you. Now, that doesn't mean it's not systematic in the way you use it, but it's individualized from that perspective, right? And another point, just to kind of add to that is, and I've always thought this was kind of interesting, is that we go to school, we send our children to school, and everyone learns the exact same thing and is tested in the exact same way. How does that prepare our children to be competitive? If we're all just learning the exact same things, how do you actually stand out? And what you start to notice when you go into the research around education is there are certain people who you can predict, even when they're 3 years old, that they're going to be at the top of their class when they go through high school, for example, based on just their foundation and their vocabulary when they're young children. And so the school system itself is not really doing a lot for those people. They're already on their pathway. And so, for example, those students would have been the ones who were educated at home and became like your Thomas Edisons, and your Ben Franklins, and then other people where they didn't go to a lot of formal schooling necessarily, but they learned from home and they learned through experience and other things, and they were able to read, right? But they got that primarily from their parents and so forth. And so I think that we're looking at now it's not really a return to the past, but it's taking elements and synthesizing everything, where you're going to have a lot more one-on-one mentorship now. You're going to have a lot more, things happening from the home within the family and so forth, that because the family itself is really the foundation for society. And when we take our children, we put them into a system where, okay, someone else is determining what they should learn and what place they're going to play in society, the parent loses a lot of control over that, right? And you see there's a lot of issues even from people who are religious or have different belief systems and so forth that starts to conflict with, what's going on in the schools and all of that. But to get back to the real point of your question, what it really comes down to is the school system was designed to fulfill the industrialist desire for an industrialized society. And so now we have a society that's going post-industrial, right? And now we're bringing everything back into the home. There's not going to be as many jobs because they're being replaced by automation and AI and other things. And so the question is, what do you do for the average person then, where, if you take away the job and there's no job interviews to go to, they don't know what to do. They're lost. They don't have the creativity to now create something for themselves from home, because that ability to do that is based on your educational foundation and your ability to read and process information, all the things that we work with TechnoTutor. So with TechnoTutor, it's less about what is the curriculum that you're going to follow from the perspective of, are you going to study this part of history? Are you going to study this part of science or whatever? It's whatever it is you want to learn, you'll be able to learn it 100% and be able to apply it and understand it and comprehend it and express it and so forth. So it's your ability to take in new information, because here's the one thing I can tell you. With the industrial age, they knew what things they wanted people to be competent in, meaning they knew they needed factory workers. They knew they needed office managers. And then at a certain point, they needed people who were proficient at taking care of machines and fixing machines. And then the computer age occurred, and they needed people who were proficient in computer programming. In other words, with the school system, they could predict in advance what they needed people to be educated within, just put that into the curriculum in school, and then put everybody through that. And the ones who got through it and had a good foundation from the beginning would become effective, and they would get the good jobs. The major problem right now is that we don't know what the jobs are going to be. We have no idea. So if we focus purely on, and this is something that John Taylor Gatto, that author, talks about quite a bit, is the purpose of education should be to take responsibility for your life, not just to fill your head up with certain facts, because you don't know if those facts are going to be relevant later. Doesn't mean that you should just ignore the point of learning information and becoming proficient in algebra and chemistry and so forth. There's nothing wrong with that, and you should definitely learn all of those things. But if you just stop there, and the problem with it is, in the school system, if we then go to, well, since I know you need to learn this specific set of information, I'm not even actually going to make sure you learn it. I'm just going to test and see if you can remember it long enough to pass the test. And so that's what school has turned into, is sort of the teachers and the school system and the administrators gaming the system and producing a situation where it looks like children know calculus because they can answer the questions on the test in some cases, but if you actually have them try to apply it, they don't know what they're doing at all. And so you have this situation where in many, many cases, I see this so many times, where you have the school system taking a very smart, bright child and making them feel like they're stupid, and then taking someone who doesn't know anything, but because they have the degree or the diploma, making them feel like they know something. But when you put them into the real world, they don't know how to apply it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And so, I mean, initially as I'm listening to that, and I guess one of the main questions that I would have then, and as I start to roll through this in my head, maybe I have the answer to myself, but let's start the discussion. So,
yeah,
how has the economy survived that long then, since we have started to advance past just this industrial type of an economy? How have we continued to do what we do and still survive?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of that it's maybe like a different topic, but that perhaps goes into the areas of, how the economic system is manipulated and propped up and so forth. Because for a large majority of people on the planet, it doesn't work. And it's interesting because we can become to a certain degree insulated here in, let's say, North America or the U.S. or a first world country, and think that this is kind of the way it's like for everybody. But I always like doing this. I would suggest everybody who's listening to go onto Google and look up what is the top 1% of income globally. Okay, so if you're listening to this on a podcast, you can pause it if you want, and you can look it up while I'm talking, or you can just fact check me after the fact. But when you look it up through Google, it tells you that the average, the income per year income, okay, that puts you in the top 1% globally, is something like $32,400 a year, right? So if you've made over $32,400 in a year, you are the 1%. When we're talking about globally. Now,
apologize for interrupting you, but just to tack on to that, I Googled it while you were talking, and it's exactly $32,400. Yeah, that's the first.
It is, okay, right.
That's what it comes up as, yeah.
Right. So it's like, how does the rest of the 99%, because and I've been to other countries. I've been to South Africa, for example, and I've been to like the landfills, and I've seen the children playing on top of them. I mean, the landfill's like literally bigger than a neighborhood. It's a huge mass of trash and debris and so forth, and I've seen the children playing on top of it. And in fact, there was one time I remember where I was there, and I had to like kind of rub my eyes, like, am I hallucinating? And I could see like small structures, like small little, almost like houses that they had created out of trash that they were living in. And you don't see that in the U.S. I live in Houston, Texas, and there are parts of town, though, if you go to them, where you see like, underage prostitutes walking around, and you see, just guys sitting out on milk crates doing nothing, and, doing drug deals, and, And I've been into some of those homes where, you go in the home and they're totally concrete, bare slabs, no carpet, bare mattresses on the ground. And, the refrigerator's all duct taped up. There's a big screen TV that's got big cracks in it. And their couch is, like the pull-out back seat of a van. And their table is like an igloo cooler. And that's literally all they have. And, there's lots of drugs and all this stuff going on, right? So it's not really working for most people. And I think, again, going back to this whole thing with what's going on right now, with regards to this virus and everything and this, quote, global pandemic, is that people are starting to see in the first world, oh, this is what it's like to be totally insecure with my income. And not even just like, living paycheck to paycheck, like I'm not even going to get paychecks anymore. Like what's going on? And totally depending on now, you look at it, not everyone literally, but most people I think are like, okay, what's the government going to do? What are they going to do? It's like we're all looking for how's the government going to fix this? And so the ability for people to actually take self-responsibility is very low, right? And this is a product of, it's not just the education system, but to a large degree it is, but it's also our mass media. It's also government policy and other things and economic policy and so forth. But the education system has a big role to play within it because up till now, and it probably will continue for some time, the education system, and when I say that, I mean, the public schooling system, but even the private schools and the universities all fall into this category. There's not really much of a difference per se between public and private school, just from the perspective of what you're taught, 90% anyways. With the exception of, you have a different peer group, you might have better, looking buildings and your peers are maybe, more upper income and so forth. There might be more self-discipline required, but, it's not like algebra at a private school is a different algebra than at a public school. It's just you're probably going to be a little bit more focused on it when you're in a private school. And I know because I used to tutor all of those different, types of students and so forth. But the problem that I'm seeing right now, and you're seeing this response, and it's difficult to know what to even believe, let's say, within all the information coming around with this pandemic, and you can go into all kinds of areas of ideas and theories and so forth, but it's difficult to know because it's kind of like that whole fog of war situation where you see information and 24 hours later it's been totally reversed and it's different information now, so you don't really know what information you can trust. It's very much like a wartime situation where there's a lot of misinformation going around and people claiming things and not claiming, and all kinds of stuff. So it's a very challenging situation. But the one thing I can say for sure is that the emotional stability of people is what's really being tested right now, and that automatic reaction of going into panic, and justifiably so from a certain perspective, because they don't know what to do, and we don't trust that the government or whoever is going to sort things out in a way that's best for everybody. So it's a very challenging situation, but the education system has not prepared us for this event, and now it's really time to, because I do think we'll get through this. People will go back to work to a certain degree. Many people are going to suffer, but at the same time, many people are going to get back into the swing of, in a certain sense, returning to life as normal. But I think that, like they say, a mind that's once stretched can never return to its previous state. It's like a rubber band. You stretch it too far, it won't go back. I think that people are going to remember from this at the very least, like, hey, we need to start really looking at the future and not just pretend like it's just way far off. And so it's giving us that preview, like I said, of, okay, so all of our children are at home. I don't know how to support them because I don't remember any of the stuff that they're learning in school. And, hey, isn't that weird? It seems like they're teaching division differently than I learned it, or, whatever the case may be. And so I understand that pressure that parents are feeling. But, the reality is education, real education, is much more simple than you might think it is. It's less to do with, what you're learning, and it's more to do with how you're learning, which is kind of the opposite of the way that the school system focuses on it. It's all focused on what you're learning. And I saw this something interesting, like last week, there were these schools saying, I think this was in the UK, and it had to do with like their end of year testing and so forth. And they were saying that they had enough information already. The teachers could make the assessment of what final grades that the students should get, even though they're not even in the last quarter of the school year, and they didn't even need to do the final testing. And I was really looking at that, and I was talking to my wife Katie about it, and it's like, so in other words, it's not about what you're actually learning, because how can you pass 5th grade if you didn't finish all the information? And so they're saying that teachers can just, based on the grades so far, determine, okay, this student should get an A, this student should get a B, and so forth. I mean, that really shows you right there, it's not about what you're actually, it's not even really about anything other than just getting through that level and then going on to the next level and so forth. It's exposing, again, a lot of the cracks in the system. I don't know if I answered your original question.
No, you did. You did. And this is such a complex topic.
I know.
We are not going to be able to cover all of it by any means. This is really just the tip of the iceberg to hit some of those people and start this conversation who are, this is top of mind awareness for almost the entire, at least in America, but for almost the entire world right now. What the heck are we going to do? How are we going to teach our kids when something like this happens? So it's forcing the conversation.